Chapter 3. The Sorting Ceremony. As Neville stepped through the grand oak doors of Hogwarts, his eyes widened in awe at the sight before him. The door swung open to reveal a tall, black-haired witch in emerald green robes. Her stern expression made Neville feel rather uneasy, but he couldn't help but feel a sense of reverence in her presence.
"The first years, Professor McGonagall,"
the man announced, his voice filled with respect for the formidable witch. "Thank you, Hagrid. I will take them from here," Professor McGonagall replied, her tone firm and authoritative as she pulled the door wide open. Neville and his new classmates followed Professor McGonagall into the entrance hall, which left them all speechless. The vast space was illuminated by flaming torches that lined the stone walls. The ceiling soared high above them, and a grand marble staircase stood prominently before them, leading to the upper floors of the castle. The distant sound of hundreds of voices drifted through a doorway to the right, signaling the presence of the rest of the school already gathered. However, Professor McGonagall led the first years into a small, empty chamber off the hall, away from the noise and bustle of the main gathering. Professor McGonagall, with her stern demeanor softened ever so slightly, addressed the group. "Welcome to Hogwarts," she began, her words carrying a sense of gravity and importance. "The start of term banquet will begin shortly, but before you take your seats in the Great Hall, you will be sorted into your houses." The significance of the sorting ceremony was not lost on Neville and his peers. Professor McGonagall continued, "The sorting is a very important ceremony because, while you are here, your house will be something like your family within Hogwarts. You will have classes with the rest of your house, sleep in your house dormitory, and spend free time in your house common room. The 4 houses are called Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin. Each house has its own noble history, and each has produced outstanding witches and wizards. While you are at Hogwarts, your triumphs will earn your house points, while any rule-breaking will lose house points. At the end of the year, the house with the most points is awarded the House Cup, a great honor. I hope each of you will be a credit to whichever house becomes yours. The sorting ceremony will take place in a few minutes in front of the rest of the school. I suggest you all smarten yourselves up as much as you can while you are waiting." Professor McGonagall casted a discerning glance over Neville's cloak, causing him to feel a wave of nausea. However, her gaze shifted to a smudge on Ron's nose, momentarily alleviating Neville's unease as he realized he wasn't the only one being scrutinized. "I shall return when we are ready for you," Professor McGonagall announced before stepping away, leaving Neville and his fellow first years to wait in silence. The weight of the impending sorting ceremony hung heavy in the air, and Neville's nerves only intensified as he overheard a conversation between Ron and Harry. "How exactly do they sort us into houses?" Harry inquired, his voice tinged with curiosity. "Some sort of test, I think. Fred said it hurts a lot, but I think he was joking," Ron replied, his words sending a shiver down Neville's spine. A test? Neville's mind raced with worry. He hadn't even had a chance to learn anything yet, and the thought of being tested in front of the entire school filled him with dread. As Neville surveyed his fellow first years, he noticed the fear and uncertainty mirrored in their expressions, except for Hermione, who seemed absorbed in her own world, whispering about spells she had learned and contemplating which ones she might need. The air was thick with anxiety, each student lost in their thoughts, contemplating the houses they might be sorted into. Suddenly, a commotion erupted behind Neville, causing him to startle and nearly lost his balance. The sound of screams filled the chamber, and Neville's heart raced as he turned to see what had caused the uproar. To his surprise, about 20 ghosts had materialized through the back wall, their pearly white transparent forms gliding effortlessly through the room. The ghosts paid little attention to the first years as they drifted past, engaged in their own conversation. One ghost, resembling a fat little monk, was advocating for forgiveness and second chances. "Forgive and forget, I say. We ought to give him a second chance," the monk-like ghost declared. Another ghost, adorned in a ruff and tights, replied, "My dear friar, haven't we given Peeves all the chances he deserves? He gives us all a bad name, and you know, he's not really even a ghost. I say, what are you all doing here?" Neville and his peers remained speechless. "New students!" the fat friar greeted them, his gaze sweeping over the group. "About to be sorted, I suppose?" he inquired, eliciting a few nods of confirmation from the nervous students. "I hope to see you in Hufflepuff," the friar exclaimed cheerfully, a hint of nostalgia in his voice as he mentioned his former house. Before any further pleasantries could be exchanged, Professor McGonagall's sharp voice cut through the chamber, signaling the imminent beginning of the sorting ceremony. The ghosts floated away through the opposite wall, disappearing from view. "Now, form a line," Professor McGonagall instructed the first years, her no-nonsense tone brooking no argument. Neville felt a strange heaviness in his limbs, his heart pounding with anticipation and nerves as he fell into line. As they followed Professor McGonagall out of the chamber, Neville's mind raced with thoughts of the houses they might be sorted into. As the doors to the Great Hall opened, Neville's nerves seemed to drift away as he took in the magnificent sight before him. The enchanted ceiling reflecting the starry night sky above. The hall was bathed in the warm glow of thousands of floating candles, casting a magical light over the room. The 4 long tables where the older students sat were adorned with shimmering golden plates and goblets, creating a spectacle of luxury and grandeur that left Neville feeling awestruck. He couldn't help but wonder if his parents had once sat at these very tables during their time at Hogwarts. At the head of the hall, a long table was occupied by the Hogwarts teachers, their authoritative figures overseeing the proceedings of the sorting ceremony. Professor McGonagall guided the first years up to this table, arranging them in a line that faced the rest of the students, with the teachers standing behind them. Professor McGonagall placed the 4-legged stool in front of the line of first years. His heart pounded in his chest as he watched her carefully set a pointed wizard's hat on top of the stool. The hat was old, tattered and soiled, with patches and frays that gave it a distinctly eccentric charm. It reminded Neville of something his grandmother might keep for sentimental reasons, refusing to part with it despite its worn appearance. The Great Hall was hushed as all eyes turned to focus on the curious hat perched atop the stool. He could sense the collective nervous energy radiating from his fellow first years, each of them bracing themselves for the moment when the sorting hat would determine their fate. As the seconds ticked by in tense silence, a sudden movement caught Neville's attention. The hat twitched ever so slightly, causing a ripple of excitement to course through the assembled students. Then, to everyone's astonishment, a seam near the brim of the hat split open, widening like a mouth preparing to speak. Before anyone could react, the sorting hat began to sing. Its voice was ancient and wise, resonating through the great hall with a haunting melody that held the attention of all who listened. "Oh, you may not think I'm pretty, but don't judge on what you see. I'll eat myself if you can find a smarter hat than me. You can keep your bowlers black, your top hats sleek and tall, for I'm the Hogwarts sorting hat and I can cap them all. There's nothing hidden in your head the sorting hat can't see, so try me on and I will tell you where you ought to be. You might belong in Gryffindor, where dwell the brave at heart. Their daring, nerve and chivalry set Gryffindors apart. You might belong in Hufflepuff, where they are just and loyal. Those patient Hufflepuffs are true and unafraid of toil. Or yet in wise old Ravenclaw, if you've a ready mind, where those of wit and learning will always find their kind. Or perhaps in Slytherin you'll make your real friends. Those cunning folk use any means to achieve their ends. So put me on, don't be afraid, and don't get in a flap. You're in safe hands, though I have none, for I'm a thinking cap. Neville watched as the Sorting Hat concluded its enchanting song, the final notes lingering in the air before fading away. The great hall erupted into applause, a cacophony of cheers and claps reverberating off the stone walls. The hat gracefully acknowledged each of the 4 tables with a bow before settling back into a state of stillness, its mystical presence commanding the attention of all present. A wave of relief washed over Neville as he realized that his moment had finally arrived. All he had to do now was put on the hat and await its decision. Putting on a hat was a simple enough task. Anyone could do that. Professor McGonagall stepped forward, a long roll of parchment in her hands, her gaze sweeping over the line of first years. "Abbott! Hannah!" Professor McGonagall's voice rang out clearly in the hushed hall, and a pink-faced girl with blonde pigtails stumbled forward from the line. Hannah placed the hat on her head, causing it to slip down over her eyes, and perched herself on the stool. A moment of suspense hung in the air, the students holding their breath as they awaited the Sorting Hat's decision. Then, breaking the silence, the hat's voice boomed confidently. "Hufflepuff!" The Hufflepuff table erupted in cheers and applause as Hannah beamed with delight, making her way to join her new housemates. The ghost of the Fat Friar floated by, his jovial wave momentarily distracting Neville from his own thoughts. The sight of the friendly ghost brought a small smile to Neville's face, momentarily easing his nerves. As Professor McGonagall called out the next name, Neville's attention snapped back to the present. "Bones, Susan!" The hat's voice rang out once more, declaring, "Hufflepuff!" Susan hurried off to join her new housemates, a look of excitement on her face. The sorting continued. "Boot Terry!" was proclaimed to be a Ravenclaw, and was welcomed with cheers from the Ravenclaw table as he sat down. Neville stood in line, his hands clammy with nerves. As the Sorting Hat continued its work, sorting student after student, he knew it wouldn't be long before his name was called. He watched as Justin Finch Fletchley was sorted into Hufflepuff. When Finnegan Seamus was called next, Neville's eyes flicked to the sandy-haired boy standing next to him in line. Seamus sat on the stool, the Sorting Hat taking its time before finally declaring him a Gryffindor. And then, as if in a blur, Hermione Granger's name was called. Neville watched in awe as the brilliant witch practically sprinted to the stool, her eagerness evident in every movement. Placing the hat on her head, the hat took quite a long time to decide until it broke the silence, shouting, "Gryffindor!" The Gryffindor table erupted in cheers, and Neville could hear Ron groaning behind him. "Longbottom! Neville!" Professor McGonagall's voice echoed through the great hall, calling Neville forward. As he walked towards the stool, a wave of nerves washed over him, his steps feeling unsteady beneath him. In his nervousness, Neville stumbled and awkwardly fell on his way to the stool, drawing a few chuckles from the watching students. Seated on the stool, Neville felt the weight of the Sorting Hat on his head as it began its deliberation. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly, each passing moment intensifying Neville's anxiety. Thoughts raced through his mind. Had he done something wrong? Was the hat having trouble sorting him? Panic started to set in as Neville's mind raced with uncertainty. The seconds felt like hours as he awaited the Sorting Hat's decision, the anticipation nearly suffocating him. And then, just as Neville's nerves threatened to overwhelm him completely, the hat bellowed out, "Gryffindor!" Neville couldn't believe his ears. Gryffindor? Him? The house of bravery and courage? A rush of emotions flooded through him, disbelief, joy, and a deep sense of pride. He had always imagined himself in Hufflepuff, just like his grandmother had expected. This unexpected turn of events left him feeling elated and overwhelmed. Tears welled up in Neville's eyes as he realized he had been sorted into the same house as his parents. Walking in their footsteps felt like a dream come true, a connection to his family that he had never dared to hope for. He was so lost in his emotions that he almost forgot to remove the sorting hat, running off with it still on his head in a daze. Amid the laughter of his new housemates, Neville had to jog back to the stool to return the hat to Morag McDougal, who had been sorted into Slytherin. As he took his place at the Gryffindor table, a sense of belonging washed over Neville, filling him with a newfound confidence and determination to live up to the legacy of his house. When Malfoy Draco was called, he walked with a confident swagger to the stool. As soon as the hat touched his head, the hat roared, "Slytherin." Malfoy drew a smug smile and walked towards the Slytherin table, glaring at all the other houses as if they were below him. As the sorting continued, the names of the remaining students were called out one by one. Neville watched as the Patil twins were sorted into different houses. Sally Ann Perks found her place in Hufflepuff. And then, "Potter, Harry!" Neville sat at the Gryffindor table, his eyes fixed on Harry as he stepped forward to be sorted into his house. The great hall was alive with whispers, the sound like a soft murmur that seemed to fill every corner of the room. Neville knew what it was like to feel out of place, to be unsure of where you belonged. Neville couldn't imagine how it must feel to have everyone's eyes on you, dissecting your every action and word. As the sorting hat deliberated over Harry, Neville's nerves seemed to amplify, his own anxiety reflecting in the way he fidgeted in his seat. In that moment, Neville found himself silently rooting for Harry, hoping that the outcome would bring him the comfort and acceptance he deserved. The great hall seemed to hold its breath, every pair of eyes in the room trained on the boy who lived. Neville noticed Professor Dumbledore watching intently, his piercing gaze just visible behind his half-moon spectacles. Neville's own sorting had felt like an eternity, but the moments ticking by as Harry sat beneath the sorting hat felt even longer. Neville couldn't help but feel a surge of nervous energy coursing through him, his fingers tapping anxiously on the wooden surface of the Gryffindor table. And then, with a suddenness that made Neville jump in his seat, the sorting hat called out, "Gryffindor!" The Gryffindor table erupted in cheers and applause, students leaping to their feet in celebration. Neville's heart swelled with joy as he realized that Harry Potter, the boy who lived, was now a Gryffindor just like him. As the cheers and congratulations continued to echo through the Great Hall, alongside a chant of, "We've got Potter! We've got Potter!" led by two Gryffindor twins, who Neville suspected were Ron's older brothers. Neville felt a surge of excitement building within him. He couldn't wait to write to his grandmother, knowing that she would be overjoyed to hear the news. The image of her reaction, of her falling off her chair in shock and delight, brought a chuckle to Neville's lips. With only 3 students left to be sorted, the tension in the Great Hall mounted once again. "Turpin Lisa!" called out the professor, and the Ravenclaw table erupted in applause as another student found their place among the wise and clever. And then it was Ron's turn, the red-haired boy looking visibly nervous, his face pale with anticipation. Neville watched as Harry discreetly crossed his fingers under the table. The sorting hat descended upon Ron's head, and then, in a burst of relief and joy, the hat declared, "Gryffindor!" Neville rose from his seat along with the other students, clapping enthusiastically as Ron made his way to the Gryffindor table and settled in next to Harry. Neville's attention turned back to the sorting hat as only one student remained to be sorted. "Zabini, Blaze!" called out Professor McGonagall. Neville watched intently as the Slytherin table welcomed their newest member with a mixture of applause and nods of approval. With the sorting complete, Professor McGonagall rolled up her scroll and took the sorting hat away, signaling the end of the ceremony. The great hall buzzed with conversation and excitement as the newly sorted students settled into their respective houses, eager to begin their Hogwarts journey.